Hi, and welcome to the And1 Podcast. I am your host, Alex West, and today I'm joined by Eric Spyropoulos, the editor-in-chief of the 94 Feet Report, and we give our most controversial NBA hot takes, so it's an enjoyable episode. Make sure to follow me on Twitter at AlexWestNBA. Follow the show at And1 Analytics. Make sure to subscribe on YouTube, on SoundCloud, on iTunes, wherever it is you get your podcasts, and I appreciate all of you for listening. It really is a big deal. I enjoy knowing that people are listening to my ridiculous NBA takes, of which I fill this whole episode up. So, Brent, take us away. So I'm joined today by my guest, Eric Spyropoulos. Eric, how are you, sir?
I'm doing pretty well. Can't complain. Happy to be back on the show. I think the last time I was on was in June, I think, or maybe early July.
It has been a while. It's definitely been, I think it was late June, so we're talking about 6 months since you've been on the show. So welcome back.
Great to be back on the show. Great to be back.
And we brought you in for one of the hottest takes of the year. We're going to do our unpopular NBA opinions. The NBA Twitter sphere certainly has opinions about a lot of things, and I think sometimes as writers we have ideas that go against the grain, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So Eric and I both made lists of opinions that we think are probably against the cultural zeitgeist. So we're going to throw those at you, and you ready to get started, Eric?
Absolutely. Always love to fire up the hot takes.
And that is exactly what we're going to do. Okay, so we're going to start with a pretty controversial one, an issue that I think we come down on different sides of it. But independently, we both came up with a Houston Rockets hot take. So I'll let you start with yours, and then we'll go into mine. And
okay.
Not surprisingly, opposite sides of the spectrum here.
Well, it is opposite sides of the spectrum, but I kind of want to say that I lean towards your side just in a different perspective. So my take, and this might not be that hot for some people, but for others it probably is. So obviously everyone's talking about the Rockets. They've won 13 straight. They have the best record in the league. You know, people didn't really expect them to gel this quickly. And a lot of people are starting to really take them seriously as a threat to the Warriors. Now, I think some of that is just because people want to believe in a threat to the Warriors, because people just don't want to assume the Warriors are going to cakewalk to the final. So that's why teams or fans and analysts are trying to buy in as much as possible to the closest team to the Warriors. And right now that looks like the Rockets. And that's understandable because as fans, we want teams to get tested and we want to see great playoff series. We don't want to see sweeps, you know, all three rounds. So a lot of people are taking the Rockets seriously. My take is that I think the Rockets actually need another piece, and specifically a wing player that can create. Because obviously James Harden and Chris Paul are one of the best backcourts in the league, and they can kill, 29 or 28 of the other teams in the league. But the Warriors are that team that can really go for Harden and CP3, and that'll put a lot of pressure on the Rockets' other players like PJ Tucker, Luke Mbah a Moute, Ryan Anderson, these players that cannot create for themselves at all. They need those guards to create for them. And I know Eric Gordon is a fine secondary playmaker, but you don't want to rely on him to create your offense down the stretch in the playoffs. So I think that because the Rockets have so many dependent one-way players, like, Tucker and Mbah a Moute are great defenders, Anderson's a great shooter, but they're just really one-way players. They need, and would be great for them to have a wing that could create, so that way if the Warriors, really pressure Harden and Chris Paul, they have a wing that could create for others and himself in the playoffs. And the other thing I want to talk about the Rockets is that they're going to have to probably go small a lot against the Warriors, because Clint Capella really struggled on opening night and has struggled in the past playing against the Warriors. So if he can't play his usual 25 minutes, if he's limited to like 18 to 20 minutes, you need to go small, and that's why another wing that can create would be really for them. My take really is that they just need another piece, and specifically a wing.
I don't disagree with that. I mean, I think that that's very good perception, because, like you said, Clint Capella was not effective. I mean, he's been a player. This has really been the coming out party for Clint Capella this season, and he's shown himself to be one of the, the new style of NBA bigs, a guy who can rim run and is a rebounding beast, a guy who can grab 20% of the defensive rebounds, hit those big percentages. But when it comes to playing the Warriors and they play a lineup with Durant and Green, there's not a lot of place for him to be. So to get that extra wing, particularly one that can create off the dribble, would be a really big deal. Now let me ask you a question. Who is that? Do you know, or is it just you sort of just floating it out there into the aether?
Well, my a dream would be if they would be able to get Tyreek Evans, but he's playing too well to probably exceed their trade assets. But I mean, Tyreek Evans on the Rockets. I mean, I would really get excited and really be interested in that series, and would potentially think that the Rockets could push the Warriors to 6 or 7 games if they were able to get someone like Evans, who is somehow still shooting over 40% from three, can create for himself, can create for others as a natural scorer. Not terrible defensively. He's capable of switching. That would be a dream kind of wing player to create. But again, he's playing so well that I'm not sure the Rockets, with their limited trade assets, would be able to get him. But he would be an ideal kind of player.
Now, he's on a 1-year deal in Memphis, unless I'm mistaken. And it's a pretty small deal. It always depends on what Memphis wants to do, because they seem to be so far out of the playoff race. I could see them moving, and it doesn't seem to be like they would need a lot to get that kind of deal done. Yeah, he's on a 1-year deal, and he is making $3.2 million. So it's not a huge number. Maybe it could be a possibility. I don't know how Daryl Morey would like to part with maybe a draft asset or something, but I don't see it being unbelievable to get Tyreek Evans.
Yeah, I don't think it would be that ridiculous. Depends, again, if the Grizzlies want. I mean, the Grizzlies should move him. It would make absolutely no sense to keep him, especially with how far they've fallen off. And if they decide to move him, I mean, the Rockets have a first-round pick. I think they can trade in 2020. That's 2 years off. They can't really. They traded away their 2018 pick in the Chris Paul trade that eventually made its way to the Hawks. And they don't really have any young players you would get excited about. I mean, Zhao Qi, has some potential, but you want to trade for him. Troy Williams really has not really shown anything, and he was already in Memphis last season. Chinano Onuaku. I mean, they don't really have any young players to trade away. And they really only have that first-round pick. I think would be the earliest they could get traded is 2020, I think. So does that get it done? I'm not sure. But there probably is another team that's more on the fringe of the playoffs that would trade a little bit more for Tyreek Evans. But
yeah,
to kind of speculate.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, I'm sure somebody can trump the offer, but it sort of depends on how the next few weeks play out. Memphis is bad. There's no doubt about it. And I think they're probably to the point where they're going to look to start unloading things. I mean, obviously we know with David Fizdale's firing that, Gasol was unhappy. He may move. I don't know. Conley has been out with injury. So that's a team that has a lot of questions. Now, I'm going to flip this around on you, and I'm going to hit you with my Rockets hot take. And it's going to be pretty hot. My hot take is the Rockets have to get past the Spurs before we talk about Rockets Warriors. So here's the deal. People have been talking about Rockets Warriors, and I've seen this a couple of times over the past couple of days because the Rockets have been playing really well, and you can't take that away from them. But I keep seeing, are the Rockets a real threat to the Warriors? And I think that we're sort of taking into account that this would be a Western Conference Finals matchup. But if the Warriors end up with the top seed, which, maybe they don't, and maybe I'm talking out of turn here, but if it ends up the way we think it will, with the Warriors at the top, the Rockets second, and then the Spurs third, I think it's a very important conversation to be had to think, can a Mike D'Antoni team get past the Greg Popovich team? And I feel like we've jumped to the conclusion that the Western Conference Finals will be the Houston Rockets against the Golden State Warriors when Popovich is 5-0 all-time against Mike D'Antoni. He's got a 20-6 record in the playoffs. He beat him in the conference finals in 2005, the semis in 2007, the first round in 2008, a sweep in 2013, and then 4-2 last season in the semis. So this is dominance across a large period of time. And I think one of the things that we always forget about the Spurs, I mean, not necessarily forget may be the wrong word, but we always seem to, the memory seems to fade of how good of a playoff coach Greg Popovich is. And to me, that's a big deal. I think it's something we have to take into account, even though the Rockets are much improved. They're, like you said in your article today, you were writing for Hoops Habit. I read, the fifth best defense in the league, taking into account of taking garbage time out. And this is a team that's a lot different than it has been, but I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong here, but I feel like we're looking too far past the Spurs to a potential Rockets Warriors Western Conference Finals.
Yeah, it always gets me uncomfortable when fans and analysts are just so sure that they know what's going to happen for the conference finals and put the Rockets there already. I agree that while I would favor the Rockets in a series with the Spurs this year for that improved defense and the added Chris Paul factor is just so significant in the playoffs where he can actually just kill in the mid-range. If the Rockets had Chris Paul, last year, I think they honestly would have won that series because what the Spurs did is they dropped a big, and so they always had a big at the rim, and they would just press up at the 3-point line, and they gave the Rockets all these mid-range shots, and they weren't comfortable, and they didn't have the great mid-range shooters to do it. So now you have Chris Paul, and if you basically give him those mid-range shots, he's just going to feast on them, which means the Spurs really can't implement that kind of defensive game plan, which means the Rockets will have a little bit more comfort and natural feeling and comfort in their offense moving forward because Chris Paul is taking the mid-range. That opens up the three-pointers, opens up drives to the rim. So I think that they're obviously much better suited to play the Spurs and at least attack them on the defensive end. And then obviously, as I mentioned in the article, and as everyone's been talking about, they're much improved defensively. I mean, last year, the Rockets had maybe you could say one above average wing defender in Trevor Ariza. Now they got PJ Tucker. Mbah a Moute is there as well. Who knows if they make a trade? I don't know about that, but Clint Capella has given the Spurs problems with his athletic rim running abilities against the older bigs like Paul Gasol. So I think that the Rockets are much better suited to play the Spurs, and I would favor them in the series. But I do agree with you that yes, it's too early and it's too I don't want to say simplistic, but it's just too kind of uncomfortable for me to kind of say, oh yeah, we know it's going to be Rockets Warriors in the conference finals. Well, we don't know that. I mean, the Rockets play such a short rotation; they could be extremely worn out by the second round, which we saw last year. Harden got worn out, and with Chris Paul, he should have more energy, but with Mbah a Moute out and Harden having this knee injury right now, they're basically playing a 7 to 8 man rotation on a nightly basis, which is actually ridiculous if you think about it. So there are concerns about the resting there and their fatigue and stuff like that. But I think that despite the Spurs being one of the best coach teams in the league, they always have these role players contributing in big moments. Yeah. I would favor the Rockets right now because of CP3 and their added defensive pieces.
I mean, I totally see what your point is there, and I don't necessarily disagree with it. Adding Chris Paul. Chris Paul's an excellent defender, and then Mbah a Moute, and then Tucker and Ariza's a good defender. Now the Rockets have a stable of good defenders that they didn't have last year. But I think it was interesting the other night, was it Wednesday night that Houston and San Antonio played? I think there was a level of gamesmanship in that game where Kawhi could have played in the second half and just didn't. And I think that's what Greg Popovich does to Mike D'Antoni is he won't show him anything. And he'll lose all 4 regular season matchups and not care about a bit in the world about it because his team is so well prepared. And I think there's just some certain level that I can't necessarily ever write out that while we look at the comparisons on paper, and I think you're totally right, I think Houston's probably the more talented team, but when it comes to Greg Popovich, he pulls a next level of effort and of ability out of his guys, particularly in the playoffs, and I feel like that's probably the crux of my argument is let's not write off Greg Popovich ever.
Oh yeah, you never write off Greg Popovich. That's one thing everyone has learned year after year. And I'm definitely not doing it. I know some people are, but I'm definitely going to be smart enough to not do that.
All right. So let's go into your next hot take. I mean, I kind of like this, so go ahead and give me your next one.
All right, we're going to stay in the Western Conference, and we're going to go to Minnesota. And my take is that Tom Thibodeau is overrated.
Okay.
And I was a big Thibs fan after he left Chicago, and he had that year off, and I really wanted the Rockets to actually bring him in as the coach when they had that whole messy 2015-16 situation. But obviously Thibodeau wanted kind of GM, president of basketball operations control, and the Rockets were not going to give that to him with Daryl Morey in town. So obviously they weren't going to get him. So Thibodeau went to the Wolves, and everyone was immediately jumping on this kind of Wolves bandwagon. Oh, Karl Anthony Towns, Andrew Wiggins, now they have a great coach. They're going to be much better defensively. They're going to stay off great offensively. They're going to be a great team. People were predicting them to win 45-plus games in that first year, even though they had won like 20 the year before. And I know with Thibs, like the player development aspect of him has been pretty consistently great throughout his career. Jimmy Butler kind of exploded under Thibs in Chicago. He always got the most out of his players, like Joakim Noah, who now is just lost, and that's mainly due to injuries, which you could probably blame on Thibodeau as well. So I get the whole player development aspect of his career has been great. He's obviously one of the best defensive coaches in the league, probably in league history, honestly, the way he implemented his system as an assistant coach, and then basically everyone in the league is starting to implement it as well on some basis. But when you're evaluating a coach, you have to kind of consider all of the aspects, and his playing time and rotations has just been killer. The facts speak for themselves. I mean, we've seen players from Chicago just be prime, even when they're just 30 years old. Like Joakim Noah is 31, I think, when he signed that Knicks contract, couldn't even play ever again, basically. Luol Deng has fallen off a cliff recently. And in Minnesota, if you look at their statistics in the fourth quarter, I think they're the worst fourth quarter defense in the league. And now that's not saying much because they're overall 26, so obviously they're just bad most of the game. But in the fourth quarter especially, they fall off a cliff defensively. They shoot most of their key guys like Jimmy Butler. I think it was like this past 6-game stretch where Butler played 5 of them was over 40 minutes, and then that 6th game he played like 39 minutes and 30 seconds. It's ridiculous. And I get a lot of Wolves fans on Twitter, say, "Oh, what is he going to do? The bench is so bad." And well, look at the bench. So when you go out and sign Jamal Crawford, who's really a one-way player who's past his prime, and Bielitsa goes down with an injury, and Georgie Gang is making $14 million to play a really limited role, and you bring in Taj Gibson for $14 million, that limits your financial flexibility to build a bench, and that's some blame you put on Thibodeau because he's in charge of doing that. So, it's tough for me to put all the blame on him for their terrible defense because, as we've seen with Karl-Anthony Towns, his off-ball defense is atrocious. I mean, it's really something else to watch sometimes. But I think that, honestly, ultimately, a coach has to be held responsible, and the growth we expected from those young Timberwolves players just hasn't been there yet. And that's why I'm saying Thibodeau's, a little bit overrated, in my opinion.
I don't disagree with you. I want to read something out to you. So 37, 37, 35, 34, and 33. Those are the minutes per game that the starters are playing for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Jimmy Butler's averaging 37.3 minutes per game. Now, I want to sort of expand on this point, and I want to say that there are 2 coaches in the league who are living off the reputation of the 2008, 2009, 2010 Celtics, and that's Doc Rivers and Tom Thibodeau. That was a great team, and I'm not sure how much coaching had to go into it when you had a group of veterans like Paul Pierce, Ray Allen, and Kevin Garnett who knew what they had to do, who subjugated themselves to this team concept. And both of those coaches have come out of that situation looking like really high-quality NBA coaches. And I'm not necessarily sure that is warranted because Thibodeau, while you said it very succinctly that he has developed players over the years, he's also run a lot of careers into the ground. And when you take this wide scope view of Thibodeau as a coach, one of the most glaring things is this minutes per game thing. Everything we know about resting, about recovery, about just the science that goes into the NBA players' bodies day to day says they need more rest, and Thibodeau is just absolutely grinding these guys into dust. Now they're 17-13, they're in 5th place in the West, all these things, and for a team that was 31-51 last year, the turnaround has been remarkable. So you certainly have to give Thibodeau some points in that respect. But on the flip side, you have to take that whole picture into account. And if Jimmy Butler is averaging 37 minutes and has no legs in April, then all of a sudden you have a huge, huge problem because the goal is not to win 50 games in the regular season, which they might do. The goal is to win an NBA Finals. And I think that this is the classic, when you're in Little League, you play Little League and you have to pitch your best pitcher in the semifinals to get to the finals, and then when you get to the finals, you don't have your best pitcher. And everybody's been through that. This is that situation where it feels like they're pitching their best pitcher in the regular season, and by the time they get to the playoffs, they may just not have any gas left.
Yeah, and I want to make 2 quick points. One is that Jimmy Butler is 4 minutes away from being in the top 10 in minutes played, and he would join Towns, who is 5th, and Wiggins, who is 3rd in terms of total minutes played. So they pretty much have 3 players in the top 10 of total minutes played, which is not a great thing either. And it's not only Thibs who does this. Obviously, we talked about Mike D'Antoni, who also, for some reason, is just known to play short rotations. Now, D'Antoni is a little bit more willing to expand in the regular season, and when it comes to the playoffs, if you see the Rockets play more than 8 or 9 players in the playoffs, usually it's 8, then something's weird has happened because that's what D'Antoni does. But Thibodeau is running these guys straight into the ground, and at least James Harden is like 20th in minutes played, and Chris Paul is playing like 30 minutes a game. So at least Mike D'Antoni is a little bit more calmed down on that aspect. But the fact that it's December and like you said, if they're not ready to play at their best in March and April when these games really count, and they get eliminated in the first round, which might be one of my takes later on, I want to spoil the rest of the episode. happens, you have to put the blame on Thibodeau for, one, not being able to build a proper enough bench, and two, for running these guys into the ground early in the season.
Totally agree with that. All right, so we're going to flip over into my second hot take. And I feel like this might be the hottest take I bring to the table today.
It is.
This is the one that a lot of people are going to disagree on. I've even talked to some other writers that we work with. People don't like this take. And I think I'll go ahead and I'm just going to give it to you. I don't like Joel Embiid, and I don't think his trash talk is fun. And furthermore, to build on that point, I think players in the league agree with that. So everybody knows, Ramona Shelburne wrote this really big piece, this nice piece for ESPN the magazine, and it was talking about Joel Embiid and sort of how he views himself as this fun, happy-go-lucky guy who is joking a lot of the time, but definitely is very sure of himself. He's a very cocksure player, and Embiid is very self-aware. And he says in the piece, he said, I'm going to do this for as long as I can because people turn on you. He talks about LeBron, how people turned on LeBron and how people turned on Steph Curry. And I think the turn on Joel Embiid is going to come sooner rather than later. While it's fun that he does all this stuff and he makes the jokes, the 69%, the 81%, I think that there is an idea throughout the league that maybe it's a little bit premature. And I tend to agree with this. Embiid has never finished a season in college or in the pros. He's played 31 games last season. Now, he's been great. Don't get me wrong. Don't take this as a situation where I'm saying that Joel Embiid's not a good player, because he's a fantastic player. But he brings this swagger to the game like he's LeBron, like he's Steph Curry, like he has a resume. And for me, I think it's sort of an annoyance, and we saw it the other night when they played against the Oklahoma City Thunder, and he and Westbrook had a little bit of a back and forth, and Westbrook told him to go home. I think that Embiid is a little bit, he's coming over a little strong this season. And I think that probably sooner rather than later, that's going to get old for a lot of people. Fans of the league, fans got tired of Steph Curry, and it only took about 2 years. And Steph Curry has done nothing wrong. He chews his mouthpiece, and I think that's the most egregious sin that he has. But Embiid is out there every night. He's sort of clowning people. He's making fun of people. He obviously showed up the Lakers, and I think this sort of showing out behavior is something that's going to turn people against him, particularly in the league.
So this is probably the take that I most strongly disagree with you on for the list that you have, and my thing is that, one, he's a great player, so obviously he has not had success, in terms of wins and losses, and he's only played like 50 games in the NBA. But you see the numbers he's putting up: 24 points a game, 11 rebounds, 3.5 assists, nearly 2 blocks per game. If you're putting up those numbers on a nightly basis, pretty much you're allowed to trash talk, in my opinion. But perhaps the more important aspect of his trash talking and joking around and kind of personality is that this is one of the best aspects of the NBA, and one of the reasons why it attracts so many younger kind of millennial fans is because they want this drama between the players. They want them to trash talk on Twitter, and then him and Andre Drummond going back and forth and saying, "Oh, see you December 8th" or whatever, and that turns a random, I think it was like a random Saturday early evening game into like must-see TV because of that trash talking they did on Twitter like 2 months before. Like, the NBA wants to embrace personality from their players because it turns these random games into must-see TV. It creates these personalities that attract fans, whether you hate them or like them. When it comes down to the bottom line, it doesn't matter if you like them or you hate them. If they're a star and they're generating revenue and interest in their league, the NBA will certainly embrace it, and they have not been shy of tweeting out "trust the process" or retweeting some of the stuff that he says, some of these jokes that he says. And that's because I think that personality, they know if we create and kind of embrace and kind of encourage to some extent this kind of drama and kind of joking around, trash talk on Twitter, we will attract more younger fans, which will obviously set the league up for the future. And Embiid is the star of the future. He will be in 5 years. He will be one of the, probably, if he's healthy, top 5 or top 10 players in the league, along with some of the other players he's trash talking. So that's why I think that they're encouraging it, and that's why I think that some of these younger fans love it so much. And I agree that eventually people will turn on him. It depends, if he continues to trash talk, maybe he takes it a little bit too far with a trash talk some night. Maybe he somehow leaves the Sixers later in his career, and that makes people turn on him like they did with LeBron. They will turn on him, but I think that it doesn't really matter for the league and for himself because he's creating a star. He has a personality and he's attracting people both on and off the court. And that's what's, most intriguing and probably the most fun aspect about it.
So for me, the name that I bring up in this comparison is Blake Griffin. And Blake Griffin was this young stud. He missed his first year. He came in and he sort of lit the league on fire, particularly with his dunks. And everybody loved to see Blake Griffin highlights. But then Blake Griffin started dunking on people. And obviously the Mozgov dunk lives in infamy, where he basically just broke him down live on national television. And that was pretty much it for Mozgov. But I think that this is the situation where you have a guy like Blake Griffin who is particularly showing up other players in the league. And this is a perspective that I'm coming from it with. See, I don't disagree with you that while as fans we sort of take this as fun in games and it's very entertaining and we want to see these things, I think what you do when you're a Joel Embiid and you talk like this is you put a big target on your back, whether it is by in some way, some dirty play, which we've seen through the years, guys taking cheap shots on one another, or maybe it's just you're going to get other teams' best games. You're going to get other centers' best games every night. And for me, if you're the Golden State Warriors, it's okay to do something like this. If you're Draymond Green, you have a lot of talent around you. You have a resume to build on. But if you're Joel Embiid, if you're a guy who's been a little bit fragile in his career, had a few injuries that sort of nag and maybe have stuck around for some time, it probably is not the best idea to put this huge target on your back, because if somebody takes a shot at you, now I don't think anybody would do it in a dirty way, but you might see a little bit extra from everybody, and maybe that's not necessarily what you want. And maybe he's the guy who's drawing all the aggression from everybody else. Every team's got to have that guy, but usually you don't want it to be your best player. So the perspective that I'm saying when I take this Joel Embiid hot take is I think the players in the league are going to get worn down by this persona pretty quickly, and we'll start to see it reflect maybe even this year in guys going at Joel Embiid.
My last point is that I think that one of the things I think that Embiid actually wants that. I think he said when he was asked about why he kind of negs these players on like an Andre Drummond on Twitter is because he wants their best game and he wants to go against the best, playing at their best against him, because he wants to motivate them to kind of give himself a challenge. And he's done very well. He did very well. He fouled out Andre Drummond pretty easily. And he won the matchup there. And I think that on the one hand, he does the trash talking and joking just to kind of build up a personality as a fun, kind of marketable player. And on the other hand, he does it to kind of get his opponents motivated to get the best games against him. So I think there's two sides of it. And I do agree. I think it'll be interesting because, Draymond Green and the Warriors can do this, but they don't really do it that much. They do it, when they win a championship. They don't really do it throughout the regular season that much unless someone kind of negs them on. It will be interesting to see when the Sixers become that perennial playoff team, a perennial top 4 seed, if Embiid continues to trash talk / joke around at this rate. Maybe he'll kind of tone it down as they continue to win a lot more. Yeah, just something to watch in the future.
Yeah, most definitely. All right, what's your next hot take?
Stay in the Eastern Conference, and I'm going to go with the Charlotte Hornets because the Charlotte Hornets need to blow this thing up. Blow it all up. Just blow it up. Find all the bombs you can and just detonate it all.
All right.
Because they are clearly going nowhere with this kind of core, whatever you consider their core to be, because it has changed, in recent years. But they're currently 10-19 and 2-8 in their last 10 games. Steve Clifford has missed the past couple of games and will continue to miss games for personal reasons, so not the greatest thing for them. And the key thing about this team moving forward is that Kemba Walker, his contract expires after next season. And he's making $12 million per year because he signed that 4-year deal I think it was 2 years before the salary cap really exploded. And so he's going to become a free agent next summer, and he will want the max contract. And at that point, I think he'll be 29, turning 30. And if I was the Hornets, I don't want to pay that contract. I mean, if he's not going to be a player I love Kemba Walker. He should be an all-star probably again this year. He might miss out because of their poor record and, not enough attention on him, but he was an all-star last year, I believe. He's a great player, and I like Kemba Walker and I like his game, but I don't want to pay him that max contract when he's going to be turning 30 years old, especially if I'm the Hornets and I've been seeing that this core led by Walker has not done anything. So in terms of that perspective, if you want to trade him at this trade deadline, you'll probably get the most value because next year he's an expiring contract. If you can trade him at this trade deadline, teams get the rest of the season with him and next season, and maybe the team like the Knicks kind of gets interested in making the playoffs, and I think we'll talk about that later. So I think that exploring Kemba Walker's trade value makes most sense this season. And the other aspect of that, this team is in salary cap hell. I mean, they've got some expensive contracts. Dwight Howard making over $20 million, Batum over $20 million, Kid Gilchrist I think is making 13. I think Cody Zeller is making around 10. They've got players that are making a significant amount of money for they're not providing enough value. So if you can see what you can get for Kemba, maybe you can get something for Kid Gilchrist, maybe you can get something for one of their role players like Kaminsky or Zeller. I know he's hurt. Just see what you can get for some of your role players. Explore the trade market for Kemba Walker. Blow this thing up. Get a top 5 pick this year and rebuild. And I'm not sure if Steve Clifford's the right coach for that, but it's the direction this team needs to take with how this season has played out so far.
Not only do I agree with you, I think that this was probably even a foregone conclusion before the year started. And I know when it comes to hot takes, boy, we sure been agreeing a lot except for that Embiid take. But here's the thing about it. They have 116 million committed this season. They have 115 committed for next season already. They have to pay Dwight Howard 23 million. They have to pay Nick Batum 24 million. Marvin Williams somehow makes $14 million. When you look at this roster, what you see is it probably personifies the mid-major. When mid-majors, that's the term we use in college basketball a lot about these programs that aren't the blue blood programs. They're these smaller schools, and that's kind of what Charlotte is in the NBA. They're the mid-major of the NBA, and you see that reflected in their salary cap, that they had to overpay for guys to get them, or taking on bad contracts from someone else. Now, there's no way out of this right now. I mean, I don't know that any team in the league wants to take on $47 million of Dwight Howard over the next 2 seasons. Next year, he'll be an expiring deal, which may open up some avenues. But Nick Batum is owed $100 million over the next 4 years, including a player option for $27 million in 2020, 2021. This is an insane amount of money that's paid out for a team that is, like you said, 2-8 in their last 10, 10-19, and going nowhere fast. They need to reload, but I'm not sure that they can even blow it up. And so maybe that's where I disagree with you on this take, is I'm not sure that I think you have to pay out too much to move some of these guys as opposed to what you would take back in. I almost think that to move a Nick Batum, and maybe you don't want to move Batum, but to move Marvin Williams or Cody Zeller, you have to pay something out to get someone to take on the amount of money that's left on these deals. And boy, it just looks really, really bad. Now, on the flip side of that, I really like Dwayne Bacon, and I really like Malik Monk. So maybe if you want to start with that as your core and you start to work your way forward, I thought it was interesting drafting Malik Monk, who's essentially Kemba Walker made over. They're about the same size. They have about the same wingspan. This is a team that's made a lot of interesting and I think bad personnel decisions over the past few seasons, and it's really manifested itself in this 10-19 campaign.
Yeah, I mean, Marvin Williams having a career year right before free agency of 2016 is really helping him out.
Yeah.
Batum doing a similar situation as well is also helping him out. They really just spent it a lot that summer to retain most of their guys, and they brought in Dwight Howard. And I don't want to blame Dwight because he's had a pretty good year. Obviously, his post-ups are not efficient, and he turns the ball over a lot, but he's been good for them. And Kemba Walker's been good for them as well, but when he's off the floor, their offense dies, and Michael Carter-Williams should not be in the NBA anymore. It's pretty clear about that. And I agree, it's going to be tough to blow it up, and maybe don't go the full blow up, but I think if I want to see them make a move, the move is to explore Kemba Walker's trade value, because I think that he can bring in a first-round pick and maybe some kind of young player. Like if the Knicks wanted to trade maybe a first-round pick and Ntilikina to the Hornets, that's a decent return for Walker if you're not going to sign him to that max contract after next season and this team's already going nowhere. Get a good first-round pick from a different team, then pretty much if you trade Walker, you're going to be a terrible team, so you'll probably get a top 5 pick as well. You put those young pieces together with Monk and Bacon, you got a decent kind of core growing there. It's a lot better than what they have right now when they're stuck with these role players making $10+ million per year. So I would start with Kemba Walker. Maybe you can attach something to him, depending, maybe that'll lower your trade return, but if you can attach a salary that you want to get off with Kemba Walker for maybe a first round pick or something, or some kind of young asset, that's what I would start doing first. But if you keep it, if you keep going with how things are playing out, it's going to be even uglier if you stay where they are right now and don't really try and trade Walker or try and start some kind of rebuild in any kind of form.
Yeah, that's gonna be something we need to keep an eye on as fans. But the Hornets really need to do something. This is a team that has been in danger of maybe their franchise moving, or Michael Jordan and the other ownership group has made a commitment to keeping the team in Charlotte. But North Carolina is a college sports state, and that the Tar Heels, the Blue Devils, the Wolfpack. Even when you talk about football, they've had some decent football years, and Clemson's nearby, and this is the heart of college sports country, and I say that from Chapel Hill. And I think that's one of the big problems that they face as a team, is that they have to deal with that sort of thing, and they need to do something to stay exciting, to stay relevant, and that may mean 2 years of hell for them, but they got to do something. All right, I'm going to go on to my next one, and I'm going to flip it a little bit out of order, Eric, for you keeping up, because you hit on this one so succinctly. You said that the Knicks should maybe think about acquiring Kemba Walker. Well, here's what I'm going to say. I'm going to say the Knicks at 16-13 and in 6th place in the Eastern Conference should not try to make the playoffs this season. And if they do, it might ultimately lead to Kristaps Porzingis' departure. So the Knicks are great. They have been far exceeding the expectation that we have when we look at this roster. Like I said, they're 16-13. They're in 6th place. They have Kristaps Porzingis, who's one of the best young stars in the league. He's averaging 25 points a game. But when you look at this roster as a whole, let me ask you a question, Eric. This is just man-to-man. Let me ask you a question here. Who's the second best player on the Knicks?
Oh, boy. Tim Hardaway Jr.?
Sure. There you go. That's fine. I maybe I would have said Courtney Lee. I mean, just because. But
this year, Lee has been better, yes.
But, okay, so doesn't that stand to say, like, this is a roster that doesn't have a lot of talent. And when it comes to winning in the NBA, as we've seen with the Philadelphia 76ers, as we've seen with the Boston Celtics, as we've seen with the Golden State Warriors, you have to build from within. And whether that's accruing draft assets, or that's making trades, or that's you need to get talent on your roster, however you can go about it. And the Knicks really don't have a ton of talent. Now, if they acquire a Kemba Walker, now that may change my perspective a little bit, if they can retain him and if they can add another piece. But as it is right now, when you look at this roster, this is not a talented roster. And I think that if they can grab another piece this year, they can grab not necessarily a Marvin Bagley, but even like a Mohamed Bamba or somebody further down the draft list. Even a guy like Gary Trent Jr. from Duke, who's just an exciting three-point shooter with a nice big frame, a guy who's essentially just a better Tim Hardaway. They can add a really nice piece in the 10 to 13 range and still be able to move forward. And to me, that's the big argument, is this is a team that needs to add draft assets. They need to add talent in whatever way they can. And if they win this year, they're going to get themselves into that middling hell that no NBA team wants to be in.
Yeah, and the thing with I agree with this. Because the thing with the Knicks is that this team really doesn't have any room for improvement unless it's through the draft specifically. Now, obviously, we're only speculating that they could trade for Kemba Walker if they really want to make the playoffs. And the rumors are that management really wants to make the playoffs because they want to show Porzingis, I guess, something that they're committed to winning, even though that will probably bite them in the ass later in the future. But they really can't really improve anywhere. They're in salary, again, another team in salary cap hell with these contracts to Joakim Noah, which is just one of the worst contracts in recent history. Hardaway Jr. has been good. He's been injured now, but he's making $17 million. That limits them there. Courtney Lee has been really good for them. If they fall off and really want to kind of, maybe rebuild, they could get something for Courtney Lee. He's been really good this season as a 3-and-D wing. But yeah, unless they were to make a move for Kemba Walker and get him, they would probably have to give up Ntilikina and a first-round pick. That's what I think it would probably take for Walker, unless the Hornets, get hypnotized by the Knicks or something and fall into get absolutely robbed in a trade. But that would obviously be such a short-sighted win-now move that, yes, it could lead them to a 6th or 5th seed, but what does it lead to in 2 years from now when Porzingis is ready to leave or potentially re-sign and Kemba Walker be a free agent? So that's something to watch as well. But if they were able to focus in on, say, you know what, have much room for improvement unless it's through the draft. We don't have much talent as it is right now, if we were to quote unquote tank or at least kind of lower our or increase our draft odds for a top 5 pick, we could get that third building block around Porzingis and Ntilikina, and that would be a real reason to get Knicks fans excited for the future. Trying to make the playoffs as a 7 or 8 seed and probably get swept, especially if you finish as one of those 2 seeds, there's no point, in my opinion. So I agree with you. I think it'd be better if they kind of targeted the draft to get that third building block and really get this young core that really excites fans and can really, have sustained winning in the future.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting to, and you have James Dolan, who is sort of mercurial as an owner and makes his decisions without consensus from anyone. But I think it's a very interesting decision to say we want to make the playoffs this season when that doesn't really prove anything to me. I mean, what it proves to me is that you have one really, really outstanding player in Kristaps Porzingis, and while that's great, you don't want to show him you can win this year. What you want to do is show him you can put talent around him. And I think that this is a very bad way to go about it unless they can swing a trade, in which case I may change my stance on this. But as it is right now, if you can't acquire a tier 2 player, we'll call Kemba Walker a tier 2 player. He's not on the tier with LeBron, Steph Curry, but he's on that next tier, that tier of like Bradley Beal and Kemba Walker, and I guess Victor Oladipo is on there now. But you have that next tier of players, the guys who are like budding all-stars or guys who are almost all-stars. And if they can get a guy like that, then maybe you get a little bit more excitement in the franchise, and then maybe it's okay to make a playoff run. But as the roster's currently constructed, making the playoffs is almost a death knell for the Kristaps Porzingis era, because it puts you in that middle ground where you don't really have a lot of options. And if they had cap space next season, I would see this. I would say this is a good idea, because sometimes you want to, Zach Lowe talks about this all the time, sometimes you want to put yourself in a situation where you are the next big thing, and that if you win 45 games, you can present yourself as the next big thing. But they don't have cap space, so they're not enticing a free agent to come sign with Kristaps Porzingis next year because they just don't have the cap room. They already have $95 million committed next year, so there's no big name that's going to sign at a discount to play with the Knicks because it's just not that great of an organization as it was in the 1970s.
Yeah, and my final thing is that with Porzingis, like, you want to show him that you can win, but you don't want to show him that you can be a perennial 7 or 8 seed. You want to show him that you can be a top 3 seed and make conference finals eventually. You don't want to just show him, hey, look, we made the playoffs. Like, you're going to stick around for the next 5 years? Like, no, you want to show him, hey, we've got this plan. We might not be that good now. We're getting better, but here we are. We have this plan. We're going to get this another young building block, and then in 2 to 3 years, we will be a top 4 team every year in the East. You want to show him that. I don't think showing him, look at us, we made the 7 or 8 seed, we got swept. Like, you want to sign that you want to sign that extension now, or like, he's not going to sign the extension because they made the 7th or 8th seed. He'll probably sign the extension obviously when the time comes, but also if he sees that the organization actually has a concrete plan to actually improve and then stay as a good team in the future.
Yeah, I agree with that. All right, go on to your next one, Eric, because I think we have some good ones here, and we of course, as it naturally is, we've gotten a little long on these discussions. So jump into the next one.
I'm going to change my order as well, because I think that talking about the Hornets and the Knicks kind of leads me to my next take, and that take is that tanking is a viable and smart strategy for the right team in the right situation. Not every team should tank, and I don't really encourage tanking, but for teams that won't or can't sign free agents, which are teams we just talked about, Knicks and Hornets, and that are stuck salary-wise, which again, Knicks and Hornets, getting young building blocks is basically the only way to improve. And there's no point in the NBA in staying in mediocrity. Like the Sixers were before Sam Hinkie took over. They were a perennial 8, 9, or 10 seed. That was getting them nowhere. Sure, some years they were getting playoff revenue. Other years they were missing out by, a couple games here or there. And, they won 41 to 45 games every year. Like, that's good. You won, half to more than half of your games every year. But there's no kind of plan to improve in the future to become great. You don't want to stay in mediocrity. You want to, become a great team. And usually the way that happens for most teams is that you have to go to the bottom to get to the top. And I know people don't like tanking, and, for some teams it's extremely hard to kind of market to the fans that they're, you have to have a really loyal fan base that won't kind of betray you or just leave become, fans of other teams or just, lose interest. It's hard to market it to some fans. Potentially the Grizzlies are one of those teams that just can't market trading away their stars. But for some teams, it just makes absolutely zero sense to stay where they are because, one, there are not many fans right now. If you're like a Charlotte Hornets who are 10-19 and still have some star players like Kemba Walker and, Dwight Howard's not really a star, but a good player. If you're not winning now and you don't really have a consistent, loyal fan base now, what's the point of staying in mediocrity? Why not, rebuild a little bit to go down to the bottom for a couple of years to get back up to the top 4 seeds? I think that the Sixers, their tanking strategy was, first of all, one of the most extreme versions of tanking we'll probably ever see in any sport. And two, it's, hasn't worked fully yet, but we see these foundational pieces. We see Embiid, we see Simmons, we see Markelle Fultz, we see some cap space they can work with over the next, couple of summers. So we see their platform to get better, and they potentially might make the playoffs as soon as this year. So we see that it can work if it's done well. And obviously Hinkie didn't even get to finish his tanking job. But I think for some teams, I know it's hard to market. It's hard to market to fans. It's really hard to implement well. If you don't tank properly, you're stuck at the bottom for a long, long time.
The Orlando Magic.
Yeah, there you go, right there.
Yeah.
And they've done some weird things where they've tried to do a half tank some years, and then one year they just were like, you know what, we're going to get Serge Ibaka and become a playoff team, and obviously that didn't work at all. And now they're kind of back where they were. Do it right at the right moment, the right situation, and you do it well. Tanking is a viable and smart strategy.
So here's my thing on that. I want to build on that point, and I want to say this, that every tank is not the Philadelphia 76ers. When we say the word tanking, as NBA fans, as NBA writers, when we say the word tanking, what we mean is losing on purpose to get a better draft pick. Now, what that does not mean is 5 straight years of losing on purpose to get a better draft pick. And I think I'm going to roll one of my points into this really quickly and say that the mini tank, the 1-year tank, is a viable option. Now, the Utah Jazz are in a perfect situation where they have an injury to Rudy Gobert. They've sort of fallen out of what we thought they could be. They're 14-16 now. They're in the thick of the Western Conference race, but this is a team that probably can go down a little bit easier than they can go up this year, particularly with another injury to Gobert. Now, he injured his other knee, but this is a perfect example of what I mean when I say the 1-year tank. That, say they put Gobert on the shelf for a little bit extra time. Let's just make sure his knee's okay, which is a little bit of, I suppose, gamesmanship when it comes to it. But if you lose a couple more games, if you end up in the 4 seed or in the 4 position in the draft, you end up in the 5 position in the draft, there are a lot of talented players. And the NBA is getting more talented every year, particularly when it comes to finding these players. Players from Europe, players from Africa, players from the United States. The players that are coming into the league are developing well. They're finding them when they're in college or when they're playing overseas. There is talent to be had. And I think that when you get in that situation like Utah, when you're a mid-major team, when you're one of those smaller market teams, that even if you just do it for a year, even if you keep Gobert on the shelf, that is a tank that ultimately, while it feels bad in the moment, if you all of a sudden you flip it around and you go 33-48 or whatever, 33-49, that feels bad in the moment, but at the end of the line, when you have a Donovan Mitchell, a Rodney Hood, a Rudy Gobert, and then player X from next season that you bring in with the 5th or 6th or 7th pick in the draft, you're in a much better position going forward than what you would have been.
Yeah, and I actually agree with you about this Jazz mini tank. I don't even think it's that much of a hot take, really. I know for some it obviously will be, but I think that it makes the most sense because I know they're only a half game out of the playoffs, but if you look at the teams above them, you have more confidence in them making the playoffs than you have the Jazz moving up. Most likely with this Gobert injury and some other injuries. They've already had Joe Johnson miss a couple of weeks. They have Derek Favors, as a hit or miss in terms of injury. Rodney Hood could always get hurt again. I don't wish any of these injuries upon those players, but it's just possible. You have to face the facts. And if they keep getting these injuries, that's going to kill them, and you can see them falling down. But Quinn Snyder is one of the best coaches and always has this team playing hard. They just won in Boston on like Thursday or Friday, which is a very big surprise. So obviously it's hard for you to tell Snyder and the players, it's better if we get a top 5 pick. And the other things to consider is what pick could they actually get if they mini tank, because we've got some pretty bad teams in the NBA. So you got the Hawks, the Bulls, probably the Magic, Grizzlies, Mavericks. Can the Jazz fall 5 pick if they were to mini tank, or do they just have a little bit too much talent and too good of a coach to do that? So Obviously I'm not well versed in the draft. I know you are because you had that whole great episode with Patrick Oxford. But would it be worth it if they did this mini tank and ended up with pick 8? I'm not sure if it's really worth it. They do it that way. If they can get a top 5 pick, I'm obviously you can't predict the future, but if they get that top 5 pick with this mini tank, I would consider it a success. If they end up with, say, pick 7 or pick 8, do we call it a success? We don't know. Those are so many things to consider for a team that is thinking about probably implementing a mini tank for one season.
I think my argument, my short little counterpoint to that is Utah has done such a good job developing talent in-house. When you look at guys like Hood and Gobert, and even Alec Burks has come on pretty strong. This is an organization that can mold guys. Gordon Hayward came out of this organization. They draft in the Gordon Hayward was 9th. They drafted in the middle. Gobert's obviously 27th. This is a team that hasn't had a ton of high picks, but they've really nailed the picks that they've had. And I think this is a draft. This is not as talented a draft as last season, but there is still a lot of rotational talent in the 7 to 15 range of this draft. And I think that as good as Utah has been in developing their homegrown talent, they would absolutely be able to nail the 7th or 8th pick. When obviously they're going to nail the 5th pick as well, but this is an organization that has just shown their ability to identify and to hone talent. So that's my counter argument to that.
Yeah, and this kind of goes back to my take about tanking, is that even if it's a 1-year tank or a 3-year plan, if it's done by the right people, then it can be very successful. That's why, as you said, you have confidence in the Jazz to nail the drafting and the player development. I wouldn't have confidence in, say, the Magic or the Hornet. It depends on certain teams. That's why tanking is only viable for the right team in the right situation, and I do agree with you that the Jazz should implement a mini tank this season.
I totally, I am on board with that. But here's my next hot take. And this is a really short one because I'm not sure how hot this take even is anymore. When I wrote it down, I thought it was a really hot take. But now that I'm looking at it as we talk about this, I'm not sure how hot this is. But I think that the Oklahoma City Thunder should probably just trade Paul George. They've not played particularly well. They're 15-14. They finally got into that 8th seed in the Western Conference, but they've shown a dysfunction playing together with Russell Westbrook, Carmelo Anthony, and Paul George, and they have not succeeded at the level in which people thought they would. A lot of people thought that they were the second best team in the Western Conference, and they've not shown that. And maybe with 50 more games in the regular season, they'll be able to iron this out. But I think ultimately, and we've talked about this a lot, this is about organizational gambles, and I think you're taking a huge gamble if you hold on to Paul George, because George is a free agent. He'll be able to walk away this summer for nothing, as opposed to sticking around and signing and playing with Russell Westbrook. But they've not shown any particular joy in playing together, and they've not shown any particular success. Now, that could turn around, but I think I would rather have a bird in the hand instead of 2 in the bush, and I think I would probably deal Paul George while you could get something out of him. I don't know who would be a taker. Maybe the Houston Rockets. That's a name I've heard floated around, but there are some teams out there who are going to send you something for Paul George as opposed to letting him walk away next season for nothing.
I would like to agree with this, but I have to wait a little bit longer. And I know that could hurt his trade value a little bit more. But the thing is, they're 14-15. They're in the 8th seed, but they're only 2.5 games back of the 4th seed. That's just how kind of mediocre the 4 through 9 or 4 through 10 has been in the Western Conference so far. And I think that I still am of the opinion that they will turn it around, if only slightly. And even if they finish with just a 6 or 7 seed, they're still a very dangerous team for the playoffs, because in the playoffs, one-on-one scoring becomes a lot more valuable, and they have plenty of guys who can do that. Obviously, Paul George can be a go-to guy. Even Carmelo, who's looked really bad this year, can be a go-to scorer for stretches, and obviously Westbrook can take over games as well. But the other more encouraging aspect of the Thunder is their top 5 defense, and I think they're 3rd or 4th at this moment right now. That is how you win games, with a good defense and having good one-on-one scores. Obviously, their offensive, I don't even want to use the word system because it doesn't look like they have one, but their offense needs a lot of improvement. But, in the playoffs, one-on-one scoring, we've seen Kyrie Irving take over games for the Cavs, including in the finals, with just one-on-one scoring. If they can isolate against bad defenders, it's an extremely valuable skill, and they have plenty of it, and they have other situational players like Roberson and Patterson and Adams who could form this defensive lineup to face a team like the Warriors or the Rockets. So they have the pieces that encourage me for them to have a good playoff run. Obviously, if you ask me in the second or third week of January and they're still below 500, I'm like, yep, just trade George, because even if you turn it around, you might be an 8 or 7 seed and probably lose pretty quickly to a Rockets or Warriors kind of juggernaut that we see right now. So I have to wait a couple weeks before I fully agree with this take. I do. It's in the back of my head that they should be exploring what they could get. Maybe under the radar, just throwing out some feelers to some teams. What would you be willing to give up for Paul George? The market of what could be his trade value, but I don't know if you actually trade him just this moment, just for the small sliver of hope that they could turn it around and be a dangerous playoff team.
That's totally fair. I think my argument probably is built more on the crux of I would trade Carmelo Anthony if I could, because to me, a lot of the problems, particularly with the ball sticking and the lack of passing and all the things that we see on the offensive end, sort of can be attributed to Carmelo Anthony. However, I don't think there's a market for him at all, which leads me to believe you need to start exploring those secondary options, and Paul George may yield a return. So that is sort of what my argument is contingent on, is that there is some equitable return for Paul George, because if you can get something out of him, I think you probably should. And when I say something, I don't mean a second-round pick and a rotation player. I mean, if you can get something out of Paul George, and maybe you trade him to the Lakers. I don't know how the bird rights situation would work, but I'm not trying to name a trade. But what I'm trying to say is, for Oklahoma City, it's probably about looking to the future and building around Russell Westbrook. And if Carmelo Anthony brought something back, that would be an interesting way to go. I'm not sure they could even trade him for free at this point, because I'm not sure how many teams want to take him on. And so that's what I'm talking about. It's sort of that asset accrual versus trying to be a winning basketball team, which is well within their wheelhouse. But I'm not sure if they're going to be able to put it together in the window that they've created because of the Paul George free agency situation.
Yeah, and it's tough because obviously they make all these moves in the offseason and re-sign Russ and kind of present the fans with this team that many people thought would be best suited to match up with the Warriors in terms of going small and having the defenders and having enough offensive pieces. And then all of a sudden, by the end of December, you're trading them away and saying, all right, it's about the future now. That would be tough for a very loyal fan base, but it would be a hard 180 for the front office, management, coaching staff, etc. to do. And I agree. I don't think Melo even has any trade value because he has a player option that most likely, with the way he's playing, he's going to accept. That's I think a $27 million player option. I'm not sure off the top of my head, but that severely hurts his trade value. Meanwhile, George would be a half-season rental depending on which team he goes to, and would the Lakers want to give up any assets if they know they're going to sign him in the offseason? That's another story. So maybe it's another team like the Cavs maybe want to make a move. I'm not sure. But I do agree that if you, in a couple of weeks, if it's like the second week of January and they're still, below 500 or at 500 in the A seed, and I think, you still see, if you get to January, that is what, 4 months of the season you have, or 3 months of the season you have of a good sample size of knowing if this team is really going to truly work or not.
Yeah.
That's when it's time to really seriously consider the trade.
I mean, I think that's what we're coming up on, because the trade deadline is in the not too distant future. So if you're going to do something, you got to start exploring those options. All right, Eric, what's your next one?
We're going to stay in the West, and my take is that the Nuggets will finish higher than the Wolves and do better in the playoffs.
Okay.
And right now, the Wolves are half a game above the Nuggets. But I really think that the Wolves' defense will hold them back, not only in the regular season, but also in the playoffs, when obviously defense becomes even more important. And we know the saying, defense wins championships, blah, blah, blah. And my thing is that the Nuggets have quietly stuck around. I mentioned they're only a half game back, and they have not had Millsap for the past basically 2 weeks, and they won't have him for the next, months. And they haven't had Jokic for the past week or two as well, and he's going to be coming back and getting more integrated. And if you look at their, kind of basic stats, the Wolves have the 5th offense and the 27th defense, and the Nuggets have the 7th offense and the 21st defense. They're very similar teams. They're obviously both offensive-minded, both defensive end. But I think that, as we mentioned before with my Thibodeau take, him playing his guys so much, unless they make a move for a bench piece, which I think they could do actually, and that's a prediction I made on my own podcast, which has a new episode up today, a cheap plug.
You got to get those in wherever you can. I mean, come on.
Exactly. I made a prediction that they will use the OKC first round pick that they have from the Rubio trade to make to acquire a bench piece to kind of lessen the load on their starters or key rotational players. But if they don't do that, I think their guys are going to be straight up worn down. And Millsap, I know he's not playing and he's hurt, but he'll be fresh when he comes back. And the Nuggets just do a better job. They have a little bit more depth. And they could be a little bit fresher down the stretch of the season, which could make the difference by a game or two. And who knows, they might even match up in the 4-5. And that'd be very fascinating to watch because they're two very similar teams, both offensive-minded, struggling defensively. I think that the Wolves will be a little bit too worn down and have the worst defense, which is why I think the Nuggets will finish higher and do better in the playoffs. And I'm sticking with this only because I did actually pick the Nuggets to finish higher than the Wolves before the season started. So I got to stick with it, but I still think it's going to happen.
So I don't disagree with this at all, and the reason why is because of depth. We talked about it obviously earlier. The Wolves are trying to run their starters into the ground. I don't know if somebody's paying Thibodeau off or whatever the situation is to try and kill Jimmy Butler, but that's obviously what's going on. And when you flip that around and you look at the Denver Nuggets, you see a team that only two guys are playing more than 30 minutes a game, and it's Gary Harris and Will Barton. Gary Harris is 23 years old. Will Barton's 27. So they're a team that has managed their minutes under Mike Malone, and I think that's ultimately going to be what puts them in a position to be the fresher team down the stretch and to be able to win those close Northwest divisions. A couple of weeks ago, I wrote a piece for the 94 Feet Report about the Northwest Division and how every game is going to count for these guys. And when you talk about the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Denver Nuggets and even the Portland Trail Blazers and the Oklahoma City Thunder, this is a brutal division. And I think that depth is going to be such a big, big thing when it comes down to essentially for this division. The playoffs are going to start in about mid-March, where every game matters and they're going to have to start playing their best ball. And that's about the time that they're going to be able to reintegrate Paul Millsap. They're going to be able to start developing, some of these younger guys, which they've done very well, but they're going to have them play bigger minutes. And that's going to be huge, huge, huge for them down the stretch, is being able to play. When you look down the list, their number 10 in minutes played is Kenneth Faried, and number 11 is Juan Hernangomez. Both of those guys are rotational level players. So what you're talking about is an organization that has set themselves up with a lot of talent top to bottom.
And they could still make a trade. Obviously, they have. You mentioned some of those players, and they have some draft assets. George Hill's been disgruntled in Sacramento. I know he's got a pretty hefty contract, but he would fit very nicely in Denver and feel rejuvenated. And George Hill's a player that is just better on a good team rather than a rebuilding team like the Kings. If they make a trade for Hill, I would get very excited about the Nuggets' playoff chances. And my final thing is that the teams, Nuggets and Wolves, have 3 more games against each other. 2 of them out in December 27th. They play on Wednesday, December 20th, and then the following week, Wednesday, the 27th. So, and then they have a game in April. So that game in April could be crucial. It's April 5th. That's basically the last week or so of the regular season. So 2 interesting matchups to watch. I know I'll be looking out for them in the next 10 days or so. That could really decide where these teams match up in the regular season and potentially in the playoffs.
Another name that I had heard floated out there from different places was, I heard they may, had kicked the tires on Goran Dragic, which would be another interesting player to add to that. But I think that, even if they don't compromise their depth by making a trade, or if they do, they're sort of set up just a little bit better than the Minnesota Timberwolves are right now. All right, I know you got one more take that. Oh, go ahead.
I just want to say, we talked about Kemba Walker a lot. I know it would probably take the most to trade for Walker, but I would really, really like that.
Apparently, this is the And One podcast brought to you in part by Kemba Walker. But, I totally get it. Yeah, he's a great player, and he would be a great addition for them as someone who could create off the dribble to play around Jokic. All right, what's your last take, Eric? Because this is a good one. Okay,
so I actually think that I don't want to say quote-unquote smart NBA fans, but maybe more in tune or fans who pay more attention to things beneath the surface. My take is that James Harden is better than Russell Westbrook, and I think it's not that close. And I think that a lot of casual fans, especially those casual fans on Twitter, think the opposite. I think the biggest reason why is because they see Westbrook dunk and have these mean faces, and he looks so athletic, and obviously he is very athletic. They think, oh, he must be the better defender. Oh, he's more exciting. Oh, he's better. Oh, this and that, blah, blah, blah. I think his narrative of Westbrook being a crazy dunker, the most athletic player in the league, arguably, especially at the point guard position, that's built up a narrative that he's better than James Harden, because James Harden is one of the more unique players. And now I enjoy watching James Harden play. I think he's one of the smartest players in the league. I also think he's just fun to watch with he's one of the best passers in the league, and his dribble moves are great. But a lot of people hate watching James Harden play. They hate his draw fouling techniques, but I respect the fact that how smart it is. But I think because he plays like this, and obviously he had that year, I think it was 2013, 2014, and then 2015, 2016. He had those 2 years where he was just abysmal defensively. And once you develop a narrative on basically NBA Twitter, it sticks with you for a long time. Now, and Harden has been passable defensively. In fact, Harden and Westbrook are pretty much the same defensively. They're both negatives, but can be average at best. And Westbrook he just looks like a better defender because he's more athletic. But if you watch him off the ball, he gets lost arguably as much as Harden does. And on the ball, he's fine. But Harden is a stout on the ball defender because he's so big and strong. And moving to the offensive end is where I think Harden really takes advantage of this, because Harden can lead or carry an offense, I think, in ways that Westbrook can't. Last season, we saw Westbrook put up a great season, average a triple-double. He won MVP, but what did it lead the Thunder to? I mean, we saw it compromised a lot of their role players. They only won 47 games. And you look at this team, I don't think enough people focus on the Rockets 2014-2015 team, because this team won 56 games and made the conference finals. And more than half of their team isn't even in the NBA anymore. Yeah. Joey Dorsey, Donatas Moniunas, Terrence Jones, Josh Smith, Kostas Papanikolaou, Pablo Prigioni, Francisco Garcia, Nick Johnson, all these guys that played, they didn't all play a lot of minutes, but some of them did, aren't even in the NBA. Dwight Howard missed half that season. Jason Terry played 79 games, 25 minutes per game. Trevor Ariza was their second best player. They won 56 games. I mean, yeah. I don't think people talk about that. You put Westbrook on that team, what do they win? Probably 47 to 48, like the season they had last year, because those teams are very comparable in terms of talent. So I think Westbrook puts up the numbers, he puts up the athletic dunks, he's got the highlight packages, but it just doesn't lead to winning as much as Harden does with lesser talent around him.
So I have both sides of this argument, and I'm going to hit you with the counter argument first. And I'm not necessarily saying that I'm endorsing this, but this is the perception across the board. And I think one of the things pardon me, I think one of the things that hurts James Harden is the laissez-faire attitude that he brings to the game. Russell Westbrook is he's emphatic, he's very emotional. He gets involved in these big games. You saw the big dunk when he threw down and he made the mean mug to the camera. I think that's something that people identify with. They want to see a guy who's their team's best player, who's really, really dedicated to winning, and it hurts him to lose, and it gives him joy to win. Now, I'm not saying that affects the way they play in any capacity at all, but what I'm saying is, from a perspective of a fan, it's very nice to see your best player engaged, and I think oftentimes James Harden can almost appear detached from what's going on, and I think that probably hurts him when it comes to perception. On the flip side, I think that we can look at their resumes and see very clearly that it's much more enjoyable to play with James Harden than it is to play with Russell Westbrook. Now, a lot of, when I think about basketball, I watch basketball, I think, like, would this guy be fun to play with if we were playing pickup? That's just something that sort of runs through my head. I've come from a basketball background, played a lot of pickup ball. And when you see Russell Westbrook on the court, you think, oh, man, we may win some games, but it is not going to be fun playing with that guy. He's a chucker. He's going to beat the leather off the ball dribbling. I'm never going to get any good shots. I'm not really going to get rewarded for setting picks for this guy. As opposed to, on the other side, when you see James Harden is probably the second most fun player in my imaginary rankings that I just made up of who I'd want to play pickup ball with number one being LeBron, obviously. LeBron does everything, and he always rewards people. But Harden creates so much on offense that his defense, listen, it's a long season, man. Sometimes you're going to have defensive lapses, and sometimes it's going to matter, and sometimes it's not. But James Harden is a very fun player when you watch the Houston Rockets. And I think when you look at Russell Westbrook, what you don't see is a lot of people really, really enjoying playing with Westbrook.
Yeah, and again, you brought up the narrative, and that's what kind of bothers me the most, is that people. I agree. Harden is very laid back. He's a calm. He's not really. I wouldn't say he's calm. he's a weird person. He's a really weird personality. If you you hear him speak in interviews, and he does some weird facial expressions, and sometimes he gets animated during games. But for the most part, he's laid back, and that hurts him when they lose because it looks like he doesn't care. But when they're winning, they're like, "Why aren't you more excited?" It hurts him. And of course, I think another underrated aspect about their narrative is the fact that Harden rarely dunks. I'm telling you, a lot of casual fans see the NBA account tweet out Russell Westbrook's monstrous dunks, and they just think, wow, he's the most athletic player in the league. He must be great defensively because of how athletic he is. Oh, he's so fun. He must be better. And Harden has these crafty layups or these crafty draw fouling techniques that people are like, it's nothing. And then you look at him, it's like, oh, he looks like he doesn't care, blah, blah, blah. That's just his personality, and that's what kind of bothers me. But yeah, I agree with you. Just the fact that you see what Harden has done to teammates in recent seasons. I mean, it goes back to his first year with the Rockets where that team was a nothing. Omar Ashik was their starting center, and he played 31 minutes a night, and now Omar Ashik can barely get on the court, and that team won 45 games. And, would Westbrook do that well on the team? It would probably be all about him, and I don't want to bash Russ, but it's very clear that in terms of improving teammates, making teammates better, allowing teammates to excel and thrive, James Harden over Russell Westbrook. And that's a key aspect of why I think Harden is better, because that allowing those teammates to thrive and pretty much setting up teammates for success is a reason why Harden's teams, when they're both the primary guy, have consistently been better than Westbrook's teams.
I mean, listen, I can't put it any better than that. All right, I got one more, last one, and then we're going to call it a day.
All right.
My last one is get ready for Cavs Warriors 4. Now, you're a Houston Rockets fan. I'm a Boston Celtics fan. We like to sit here and we think, that our teams are going to have a shot to compete against these teams. But I think ultimately we're looking at the four-peat of Cavs Warriors 4 again. And I'll give you my reasons why. The Warriors are one of the most well-run organizations that we've ever seen. I just finished reading the book Beta Ball. Want to get that plug in there because obviously that book is amazing. But when you look at how this team was constructed, this was a team that every turn got a little lucky, but also constantly reinforced that they were smarter than everyone. And I think that's something that's shown up again this year. When they have Omri Caspi, they have Nick Young, they've developed Jordan Bell, even Kevon Looney's playing some quality minutes for them. This is a roster that is very, very well constructed. And it's boring to talk about, so I'm not going to waste a lot of time talking about it. But I think that this team is still heads and shoulders above anybody else in the league right now. And I think that probably the playoffs will be a reflection of that. As much as you spoke to the point earlier that we don't want it to be that way, I think that probably at this point in time, unless there's an injury, God forbid, to one of their major players, I don't see that this team's going to have a ton of competition in the West. And then on the other side, unfortunately, there are only two good teams in the East, and they are the Celtics and the Cavaliers. Everybody else is a cut below those teams, I believe. But ultimately, the problem for the Boston Celtics has been, last season was, and in this season will continue to be, that LeBron James is the best player in the game. The Celtics have Jaylen Brown. They have Al Horford. They have a ton of people that they can just continually throw at LeBron. But ultimately, I'm not sure that that's going to matter, because LeBron is one of those players. I don't know if you saw this dunk that he did last night when they were playing against Washington, where he did the little spin move where he was in transition. This guy's amazing. And so it's sort of a boring thing to talk about, but I feel like the Cavs are still a cut above the Celtics, and by association, the rest of the Eastern Conference, and then the Warriors are still a cut above everybody in the league.
Yeah, and there are concerns for almost all the teams that would be potential challengers. I mean, the Raptors, can you really trust the Raptors' new offensive system in terms of more passing and three-point shooting? Because oftentimes when it comes to the playoffs, teams get, players will revert back to what they're most comfortable with. And obviously we've seen what the Raptors have done in the playoffs in recent years, and it doesn't exactly, build your confidence in them to even make the conference finals, to even potentially be a challenger for the Cavs. And the Wizards have, struggled and, been mediocre, and maybe they make a move for like a DeAndre Jordan that would, shoot them up the standings a little bit, but that wouldn't really put that much of a scare into the Cavs. And the Celtics, I think, are best suited, obviously, because of those plethora of wings and, great defensive team. Kyrie Irving can take over games one-on-one, but I do have concerns about them, at least offensively, because, you have Kyrie Irving, great offensive player, but then, Al Horford is a good secondary piece offensively. He's not going to be that guy that takes over games and series by himself. And then you have to rely on other guys like Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Marcus Smart, Marcus Morris, guys who rely upon in a conference finals, game 6 or game 7, against the Cavs. There are concerns there. And then moving to the West, obviously we talked about the Rockets already. I think they need another piece, but the other fact is that they just have to stay fresh and healthy by the conference finals if they even make it. Who knows? The Spurs could drag them to 7 games. The Rockets could have a tough first-round series. They could just be worn out by all these minutes and these injuries in the regular season. They're one of the older teams in terms of their rotation. Nene is pretty old. Mbah Moute and Tucker over 30. Trevor Ariza over 30. Chris Paul over 30. They have to manage their minutes and stay fresh and healthy to even have a shot at challenging the Warriors. And then I already talked about earlier that the Warriors can make life hell for Harden and Chris Paul, which would put a lot of pressure on really dependent role players like Tucker, Mbah Moute, Ryan Anderson, Capella, etc. And then I don't want to overlook the Spurs, but we don't know if they'll even make the conference finals. Obviously, there's a lot of competition. The Rockets are really good. The Nuggets or Timberwolves could put a scare into the Spurs and wear them out because they're also an old team as well. So I agree that the Warriors and Cavs are still cut above everyone else. But my question for you is that I've been having this discussion with a lot of people is that I would not be excited for Cavs Warriors 4. I think it ends in a Warriors sweep or maybe a gentleman's sweep like last year. I would not be excited. Do you think that if you're the league office, if you're Adam Silver and you're the NBA, are you a little bit concerned about having Cavs Warriors for the 4th straight year?
Oh, absolutely. I don't think it's an interesting, narrative. I don't think there's really much to sell to people. Last year was amazing. Cavs Warriors 3, the rubber match, series tied 1-1. The Warriors win the first one, the Cavs win the second one. You couldn't have asked for a better narrative. This year, the narrative's a lot more boring because we saw what the Warriors could do at their apex. They sort of just dismantled the Cleveland Cavaliers, and I think that probably is what we're on course for again. I think it would be much more exciting from a league perspective to let a Houston Rockets be in there, to let because James Harden, he could be the new face of the league as LeBron ages, or even to get the Boston Celtics in there. The Celtics beat the Warriors, so it's a new challenge. It's a little bit different. It's a team that's a little bit constructed a little bit more in the modern NBA perspective than the Cavaliers. I think there are a ton of interesting storylines for the finals, but I don't think Cavs Warriors is one of them. And unfortunately, I feel like that we're on a crash course for that again, unless something drastic changes. And I feel like, you make a really great point. It's not a narrative that's going to put a lot of eyes on the TV or going to put a lot of butts in the seats. And that is unfortunate for a league that has grown so abundantly, so exponentially over the past 10 years.
And I know we've been going for a while. I just have a couple more points because I think this is a very interesting thing for a league perspective. Is last year, not only did you have it being a rubber match, but you had both teams being the Warriors were undefeated in the playoffs coming into the series. The Cavs had lost 1 game. You had these teams that were on historically dominant playoff runs before meeting up for that 3rd rubber match. Now it's like, now the league has to hope that the playoffs, the first early rounds are a lot more competitive. They get a lot more game 7s, maybe a lot more upsets. Because another thing that's plaguing the NBA is the amount of upsets in the playoffs. Last year, the only upset they had was the Jazz beating the Clippers in the first round, and that was a 5-4 where the teams had the same exact record and Blake Griffin got hurt. So if they have some upsets, if they have a lot of game 7s, if they have great early rounds, it just makes the playoffs overall more interesting, ultimately probably leading to Cavs Warriors 4. But if you get another one where the Cavs and Warriors both lose 1 or 2 games before meeting up in the finals, I mean, this is the one thing I think that's holding the league back. I mean, it's growing at a great rate. But even the ratings for last year's finals were, better than the year before because it was a rubber match. But I would not expect the ratings for Cavs Warriors 4 to be better than they were for the previous, couple of seasons. Maybe they would be better than the 2015 finals. But, if they kind of develop and become this league where it's like, the regular season's fun and they got all these great performances on a nightly basis, and even the first couple of rounds of the playoffs are fun. If they don't get upsets and they continue to get Cavs Warriors, who knows? We could get Cavs Warriors 5 if LeBron stays and the Cavs have a good offseason, and obviously it's too early to tell. If they continue to be this league that's like, we grow and we have a great regular season, we have a couple of fun performances during the playoffs, but ultimately we have the same finals 5 years or 4 years in a row, it's hard to market yourself to market to fans of other lesser-known teams that are like, well, we have no shot. Why should I get invested in the NBA as a young fan? Why not invest in the NFL or another team, another sports league where my team actually has a chance to win? I think there are concerns underlying Cavs Warriors 4 or maybe even Cavs Warriors 5.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I think that when you think about the playoffs last year, and let me ask you this question: what was the best game in the playoffs last year? I have two that come to mind. What is the game when you think back about last year's playoff that sticks out to you?
I think Rockets Spurs. It was Game 5. I think they went to overtime. I think that was a very good game. Grizzlies Spurs. It was game.
Okay, yeah,
that was also Game 5. It was Game 4 or Game 5. That also went to overtime in Marc Gasol with that buzzer beater. Let me think. Were there any other great ones? I mean, there was a great finals game.
I was going to say Game 3 of the NBA Finals where Durant hit the shot, and then to add to that list, the Game 7 of the Celtics and the Wizards.
There we go. I can't believe I forgot that one. I don't know how.
When you look at that list, I mean that's 4 good games out of 100 games, and that's what I think we dealt with last season. That if that's where the change would be, that if we're going to see a better playoff series, that it's going to be, and there are going to be more quality games. Because last season there were a lot of 135 to 99s in the playoffs where a team just got run off the floor early and they never got back into it. There were a couple of those early in the Spurs Rockets. The Cavaliers did that to the Celtics in the conference finals. There were a lot of not competitive games when we talk about the 48 minutes. And I think that that's something that the league has to hope and put a lot of stock into, that there will be better games in the first and second round to sort of carry the ratings and boost it. And maybe you'll be able to say, oh, look, here's a team in the Toronto Raptors that can challenge, or here's a team in the Houston Rockets that can challenge. Because if they can't sell that narrative, it's going to be a really, really tough June when it comes to ratings.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. There's some underlying concerns besides the fact that I don't want to see the same teams match up for the 4th straight year.
Yep. All right, Eric, thanks for coming on, man. I mean, we got through 12 pretty controversial opinions. Is there anything you want to get a plug in for before we head out?
So you mentioned early in the beginning, I have an article up on Hoops Habit, which is reviewing the Rocket season 2 months in. New episode of my podcast that I host with Corbin Ford, the 94 Feet Report NBA podcast, has a new episode up today. Wrote my first piece for the 94 Feet Report. I know the site's been up, but I've been doing more of a behind-the-scenes role. But I did write about the Indiana Pacers, which you can find at 94feetreport.com. And, of course, you can follow me on Twitter at Eric Spyros NBA.
All right. Thanks, Eric. We appreciate you coming on, man. And here's the thing. We won't wait another 6 months to get you back on. How about that?
Absolutely. Sounds great.
All right, man. Well, I'll talk to you later.